Okay, everybody, welcome to this special chat. We have John Boegehold here. He is from Pattern Seeking Animals, which is actually a kind of newish band to me. I think I've heard of them before, but I hadn't really listened to much of the music, so I sampled some of it. I did one of your songs I did a reaction to,
Oh, cool.
and probably going to do more. I also listened to a whole album. Turns out it was your first album, wasn't your new album, but we'll
Okay,
talk about your new album.
cool.
And really, really like it. I'm very impressed with this band. Where should we
Oh,
start?
thanks. Start wherever you'd like to start. I'll answer any questions that
Okay,
I can.
okay. So I know there's a strong connection between this band and Spock's Beard. Is that right?
hmm Yeah,
So
I was working with them, writing with them for their last after Neil Morse left like 20 years ago, whenever that was. So I wrote with them for was it 7 albums, I think, 7 albums. And then at some point, the last one was in 2018, and I had a bunch of material, and I thought I just wanted to put together my own my own band, my own project at the time. It was mostly a recording project at the time, but it was turning out so good. I decided to have, to ask Tad Leonard to do the vocals and guitars, and Dave Maros the bass, and Jimmy the drums, and that's how it started. Because I just always had a glut of material, and I wanted to keep writing more.
mhm.
Um, Also, just because in Spock Spirit there's a bunch of different writers, so it was always like musical chairs to just to see who's going to get their tracks recorded and everything. And I just got kind of tired of dealing with all that.
Right. And the new album, tell me a little about the new album.
The new album, which is our fourth album, called Spooky Action at a Distance, and it's like the fourth album we put out. It'll come out like 4 years and a couple months to the day of when the first album came out. The new one we decided to go with in a different recording studio, a different engineer, just to shake things up a bit. And yeah, I tried some more musical directions on this one. Did some things with outside backing vocalists for a couple of different reasons, and so it just went from there. Just the thing is about trying to do a new album so soon after the last one is trying to separate them. So it just doesn't sound like, we made one album and split it into two, which happens a lot. I just didn't want to do that. So took a few new directions in instrumentation and arrangement things, and tried to
Mhm.
shake things up a bit, like I said.
Mhm. And what's your connection then? You said you were doing composing or songwriting with Spock's Beard for years already, but
Yeah.
but you're not part of the touring band. You don't
Oh, no,
have it.
no.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I was never in the band, but I
Oh.
I was working with them from the beginning when they started in 90, whenever, the early 90s. Just because I was friends with Al and Neil forever, and I just heard what they were doing and really liked it, so just threw in my I'll do anything you need me to do to help you guys. At the time, I was doing a lot of graphic design also, so I helped them with that. And then I had a studio. They come over and do overdubs every once in a while. And then when Neil left, I just kind of forced myself in the situation and said, "Hey, do you want another writer?" And so yeah, from Feel Euphoria up through the last one was Noise Floor in 2018. Yeah, I co-wrote or wrote a bunch of stuff on those albums.
Hmm. Hmm.
Helped produce also.
Hmm. And you said you have a studio. Tell us about your studio.
It's a project studio. It's not like a commercial studio. In fact, if this wasn't blurred out, you'd see it behind me. It's just basic computer setup with a few different keyboards and outboard things and a ton of different guitars and stuff like that. So, but I've always had a setup in the places I've lived um, to work because that's what I do. I write and compose and everything. So it's good just to have it here.
And you're based in LA, are you?
Yes, I'm in
Okay.
Los Angeles.
Okay.
I've lived here since 1980.
Oh, okay. So how do you like living out there?
Well, I've lived here most of my life at this point. So I moved from Detroit when I guess I was 22 or 23. And no, it's great. I mean, there are some negatives, but overall, it's just where I live. It's great.
And I guess it's very convenient. Is it sort of like Nashville or whatever you're always going to be able to, if you put an ad up, you'll probably get lots of responses for putting a band together or something like that. It tends to be a lot of people conglomerating there.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
suppose I'm out of that part of the business at this point. I'm in my 60s at this point. But when you're, forming bands and at that age, when you're putting stuff together in your 20s or 30s, yeah, there's a ton of musicians here, and singers, and this is where a lot of stuff happens. So it's the place to be, for all its, positive and negative uh, aspects. Putting a band together here is not too difficult because there's so many people, but um, it's tougher to get noticed because there's so many different groups and artists and things like that.
Right. And you're in a unique genre of progressive rock, of course. Do you mostly stick with progressive rock, or do you have other genres you dabble in, or?
Well, for pattern seeking animals, it's kind of whatever you call it, progressive rock or art rock, but there's a lot of pop elements. I'm a fan of, I listen to music, I keep up on all the popular music, um, pop and rock and whatever. I just have never gotten out of the habit of doing that. So I listen to music all the time of all different stuff, all different genres. I don't write any of it at the moment. Um, every once in a while, I have a friend I'll write a song with, but that's more like country and pop stuff, which I love. Um, but no, I just listen to a ton of different stuff, and I incorporate all sorts of ideas and production ideas, and I just like keeping current,
Mhm.
with what's going on out in the music biz.
Well, I noticed the PSA for short, pattern seeking animals.
Uh-huh.
PSA is very the music is very fresh. Yeah, it just feel listening to it, it reminded me of obviously there's a strong pop rock element to it. But you could tell, I mean, I could see it a mile away. There was strong progressive rock
Oh yeah.
influences in the music, of course. And I liked it because it reminded me of let's see, it reminded me of Yes. It reminded, oh, who I should have jotted down the other influences. But I it's super fresh sounding music. It just like you were mentioning, keeping it fresh as far as different
Yeah.
recording studios, trying out different things, and that I could hear. I could hear
Oh,
that.
cool.
Yeah, I could hear that
Very
coming through.
Yeah,
So,
it's I was going to say, as far as the progressive influences, yes, Genesis, Kansas, ELP, Gentle Giant, that stuff was baked in when I was a teenager because I got into that
mhm,
music like in 10th or 11th grade and was just
mhm,
obsessed with it.
mhm.
Um, so that's where I think when you're that age, that's where a lot of people's influences gets kind of set in stone because if you go further than that along the way, you might hear other stuff, but that's always the basics of it. But I've kept, even though I started listening to a ton of prog, I never outgrew listening to pop. So I listened to it. I still listen to it to this day. Everything which is on the top of the charts, whether it's pop or R&B or K-pop or J-pop or any of that stuff, because it's the newer, fresh. It's all the current cool production ideas and songcraft ideas and structures and um, obviously my stuff doesn't sound like that stuff, but there are a lot of elements where I've heard things I like to try in my music, whether it's a production thing or a type of chord progression or whatever. It's good to listen to keep up on that kind of stuff, or else I would just keep making records, which wouldn't be bad, which sounded like selling them by the pound or the itself. You know what I mean? If you
Yeah,
just stay with that, because I'd be perfectly happy doing making like a record Genesis would make in the 70s because I love that stuff. But I just like to keep my own stuff and what we put out there as a little different and up to date.
yeah. And I noticed that too when I listened to the PSA stuff. Mostly, I listened right through the first album from 2019,
Yeah,
and I noticed that there's a strong songwriting basis to it. Like I think some prog bands you don't hear that as much,
right.
um, where there's a real like for example myself when I was into prog I ended up branching out and getting really focusing on stuff that was singer songwriter and stuff like Neil
Right.
Young, which I hated Neil Young as a prog kid.
Yeah,
Eventually I started to realize the man's a genius and a songwriting
absolutely.
genius,
Yeah.
and to be able to I think that's so important in prog too, that if you get too caught up with the progginess of something and forget about the basic songwriting principles, the music will not have the long-term kind of hold, or it won't have a long-term lasting, I guess, if you don't have that fundamental songwriting basics. So where do you get your songwriting basics from? Who do you look to over the years for, I mean, the Beatles, for example, or
Well, no, I agree. I agree with you completely. I hear prog stuff, and I just think it's just really cool music. I wish there was a better melody, or I wish there was a better chorus and something I've heard from some groups. But I like all that prog stuff. But for me, you have to have the song structure thing, whether it's just part of the song or built around it. I'd like to have that pop sensibility where you have a singable chorus and verse and a bridge and hooks. I want to hear a hook like every other bar. I just want to hear something like that in there. And then you expand from there. But to me, if a music doesn't have that in it, you're right. It reminds me of a quote from the country guy, Vince Gill. Are you familiar with him? Vince Gill. Yeah, he's great. And I remember hearing him say something years ago which stuck with me. He said, I've gotten to the point in life where I don't want to be impressed. I want to be moved. So I hear all sorts of stuff, which I think someone sent me this group. I don't know if it's Israeli or Russian. I don't remember, but it was 4 guys, astounding level of technical ability, just off the charts so good you would think this can't be good. This can't be true what they're playing. And my friend, he sent it to me and I played it, and my response was, that is the absolute best thing I've ever heard. I'll never listen to again, because you've heard it and it's impressive, but it's like it didn't connect with me anyway emotionally. So for songwriters, obviously, going back, the pop songwriters, whether it's the Beatles, the songwriters involved in the Monkees, was huge to me because I kind of came of age and I was ready to think about being in music. I think the Monkees came out when I was like 9 or 10, and the Beatles had already been out, but they didn't really make an impact at me at that point, other than another group, whether it was Paul Revere and the Raiders or Sonny and Cher, whoever was on the radio at the time. But for some reason, when the Monkees came out, it just hit me at the right time, and they had great songs, and I started paying attention to who was writing the songs, because I thought, was it those guys or was it someone else? And I would see these other names in there. So I started, getting into checking out people who were writing different music, and I'd see different names keep showing up on pop songs, whether it was, Carole King or whoever it was. And so I would start to pay attention to the singer-songwriter stuff and the pop stuff with great writing, whether it was, Lennon and McCartney, Simon and Garfunkel. One of my favorite writers of all time, Jimmy Webb, songs like MacArthur Park and Wichita Lineman, which is probably, I think, one of the greatest songs ever written by anyone of any genre.
I got that Glenn Campbell album a couple weeks ago at a Salvation Army store that has Wichita. I love that song. That's amazing.
Yeah, it has, the lyrics are so good. So Jimmy Webb has written just astounding songs over time. And you go through time, there's always great writers out there. And there's writers you never hear of that are behind the scenes who are purely songwriters through the 80s and 90s. And there are so many killer songwriters right now. Someone asked me who I thought one of the best writers was today, and it's got to be Taylor Swift.
Oh, really?
If you listen to her stuff, and obviously I think she writes to appeal to a younger, maybe more female artist or group. But if you listen to her albums, as I do, her songwriting craft is just top notch. And she's one of the few where I'll be listening to a song thinking it's great, and she'll come up with a line that kind of just hits you between the eyes, and you think, that's an astounding take. How did she, just one simple line, but it's so well thought out. So, yeah, I think she's great. But there's a zillion great songwriters out there. Behind the scenes of, different pop groups and stuff like that. Other songwriters, let's see. You mentioned Neil Young. I was a huge Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young fan. Crosby, Stills, Nash, Graham Nash, David Crosby. I have all their albums through. They produced all the solo albums. I read books about them. Recently read the Graham Nash book. There's so much great stuff out there. And I agree with Neil Young. At the time, as a kid, I was into Heart of Gold, that album Harvest. I was into it, but it kind of seemed annoying to me. even though I like the album. And same thing, I realized after listening to him in his earlier bands he was in, for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the guy was just a gifted writer. He still is. So I agree with you there. But to make a long story even longer, I agree with you. The songwriting, the basic songwriting, has to be there. Burt Bacharach, that old stuff. Burt Bacharach, Hal David wrote amazing songs. So I think that's where the basis of what I write is, and then from there you expand on it. And I think again, is if you go back and listen, I was reading something with John Anderson years ago, and everyone thinks he had these great progressive bands, which they were, but they all started as pop fans trying to expand on a pop song. That's why they lasted, because they had memorable songs you can listen to through time that have pop structures to them. Even listen to Close to the Edge, it's an 18-minute song, and there's all sorts of pop-like hooks in there, but it's put together in such a genius way that, but again, if it was something where they didn't have those pop elements and the singable melodies, we wouldn't be talking about them today, I don't think.
Yeah, I think John Anderson has mentioned the Everly Brothers more than a few times. I've heard him talk about the Everly Brothers.
Oh, yeah. Oh, in fact, if you listen to the first album, they did a David Crosby song cover. They did a Beatles cover. And John Anderson actually mentioned, someone asked him, he said, what were you trying, who were you listening to when you did that stuff? And you're right, he mentioned the Everly Brothers. He mentioned the Fifth Dimension. He mentioned, right, obviously the Beatles and everything. But I think if you go deep in, that's how those groups started, as pop writers and into it, but wanting to expand the format.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing that amazes me as a Prog fan is how many like really, really briefly, I was big into Prog when I was about 10 years old or so. Got into Mike Oldfield as a start, Alan Parsons Project, Tangerine Dream, moved into Yes, and then eventually Rush and all kinds of stuff. So then I got out of Prog in the 90s, and basically for 30 years I just checked back once in a while. I discovered District 97, like them. I got a Spock's Beard album, actually. Let's see, Mystery from Quebec, a couple bands. I just kind of checked them out, but I always thought they were just like that's just some remnants of Prog. I didn't realize that there's literally hundreds of Prog bands now. I mean, I'm getting emails about releases all the time about people still making Prog music. A lot of it is all very different kinds of styles of Prog. Mostly it's like a heavier influence, like black stuff or metal. There's fewer rock, sort of true classic rock sounds, and I think PSA is one of them. Space Kitchen, who are influenced by ELO and Rush. That's their favorite bands.
Yeah, I was a huge Rush fan, ELO too. But you're right. But it wasn't you that got away from it. I think like into the 80s and early 90s, Prog just went under the surface. There was still a few bands doing it, but everyone just assumed they were Prog niche. Was just niche, and it's going to be a nostalgia thing. Then all of a sudden in the 90s with Spock's Beard and a couple of Flower Kings, all of a sudden there was a resurgence, and with the internet, everyone could start finding everything else that was out there, and there's an explosion. And I listened to a ton of new Prog stuff too, like Big Big Train, Wobbler, just a ton of that different stuff. And no matter how much I listen to, I will open up the latest copy of Prog magazine, and 75% of the groups I've never heard of. There's so many out there, and you're right, a lot of them are heavier, which is really, a lot of it is really cool stuff. Some of it gets too heavy for my taste, although I really love groups like Opeth, stuff like that, which is great. But you're right, it's just been an explosion, and it's kind of astounding how many groups there are out there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the internet. I mean, that is so key to all of this. I think that a band in a garage in some remote area of the planet can put out a Prog album, and and it spreads around way more than it could have back pre-internet days. So the internet is an incredible tool. That's, I guess you could credit it partially for why there's maybe an explosion of Prog going on.
I think more than that. I think that's the main reason, because otherwise I'd be sitting in my basement or whatever, doing a prog band and trying to find musicians, and I can't find
Mhm.
anybody. So all of a sudden, you're connected to all these people. On one hand, it's phenomenal because you're right. You can produce an album if you're sitting in a hut in Greenland somewhere that people are going to flip over. But it's trying to get noticed. That's a part of it. Um, I think the other thing, it can also be intimidating. If you like, I started out as a bass player, for example, when I was, in high school, and I was okay. I was, no, nothing to write home about. And in Detroit, there's a few bass players that everyone knew. Oh, this guy, he's really hot. He can play like, uh, Chambers Brothers, and he can do the slap thing. And then there's this guy who plays like Stanley Clark. And there's like a handful of guys that you knew about are great bass players in the country. Now you just, you go into, TikTok or YouTube or something and put in bass player Japan, and all of a sudden there's hundreds. There's these 18-year-old Japanese girls who are playing like Stanley Clark, and it's kind of astounding. And you just wonder if that was around when I was a kid, if I would have just been intimidated. It's like, damn, there's hundreds and thousands of these players, whether it's guitar or bass or drums, and they're all astounding. So, I don't know. But overall, yeah, it's a great thing.
I love the idea of mastering an instrument. And one of the things that the impressions I got from a lot of modern music that turned me off was the idea that people were just using laptops. They were just chopping up samples of old songs,
Yeah.
regurgitating, whereas prog is very much reliant on your talent as an instrumentalist, as you're putting in your 9,000 hours, whatever it is, to be good
Yeah.
at your instrument. Obviously, you're keyboard based, right? Is that, you said you started out in bass, but are
I
you
start
mostly keyboards?
Well, I play enough. I consider myself a songwriter and producer. So I was an okay bass player. And when uh, I was in a band in the 80s and we were having trouble keeping guitar players, we went through five of them. And I played a little bit of guitar. So we just thought, why don't you play guitar and we'll find a bass player? And that's when we met Dave Maros, from Spock's and Pattern Seeking Animals. So he's essentially the only bass player I've played with since then, except for one or two small examples. But I picked up a little guitar and keyboards. I play enough to write with. I'm definitely not a master at anything. Keyboards, I'm good enough where I can play something in and manipulate it to the point where it's where I want to hear it and where I get the sounds I want. And I can play basic guitar stuff. So I'll play the basis guitar stuff, and I'll go to Ted, who plays, sings and plays guitar, and say, okay, here are the chords. Play something cool here. Play a solo here. I don't even try and do that. I can play okay rhythm and okay on the keyboard. So I'm far from being a master musician.
Well, you bring out a good point, though. Songwriting is also an art, aside from being able to play an instrument. That's something I think you have a kind of a talent for it automatically if you're kind of inclined to be a songwriter. But I do
Yeah.
believe that it's something that takes a lot of work, just like any other discipline, for sure.
Yeah, it's a song. There's the songwriting and the actual craft of
Yeah,
putting a song together, which
yeah.
is more than just coming up with a tune and a lyric. It's how is it going to fit with the chorus? Should I go to a bridge here or do an instrumental section? If
Mm.
I want to bring it back, should I do a key change? There's all these different crafts things which you learn over time. It's like anything um, that helps you. Some of the songs we do in Pattern Seeking Animals, for example, are songs I started 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because I write all the time. And at the time, I would write a song and we would record it, and it just wasn't working. It wasn't for whatever reason, and I just could give it and throw it away, even though it might have had a really cool part I liked. And you come back after many years and listening to a zillion types of different current stuff, and all of a sudden you look at it and think, oh yeah, I know how this should have been easy. You just do this and you move this section here and you go to a key change here. It's a craft like you learn anything. It's like learning a language. If you learn a language and you start out, it's intensely frustrating, and you have this list of words and you look at it and it's just you're gonna tear your hair out. And you look at it after you learn the language and you think, oh, this is easy. This is nothing. I think it's the same with songcraft. And besides being a fan of just wanting to hear a good hook or a melody in a pop song, I when I listen to something, and I listen to a couple hours a day of different music, I will just put in my headphones and listen to it purely from a songwriting and production standpoint, what they're doing with sounds, how they're getting from one section to another. And it all comes into play, when you're writing and putting, prog together. It all fits, whether it's a 2.5 minute pop song or a 20-minute prog opus. The basics still have to be there. They still have to be there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention too, I forgot to mention, the music the PSA music reminded me also of Steven Wilson, his solo work particularly.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It sort of sounded like someone who would like Steven Wilson, someone who likes Yes would like Pattern Seeking Animals for sure.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, Steven Wilson. Yeah. I was big Porcupine Tree. His solo stuff has been hit and miss with me, but he put it like hand cannot erase is just brilliant. I love that album. His solo stuff for the most part is just, to me, I find incredible. Just every once in a while he'll go on a little tangent of types of music, and it's okay, but it doesn't connect with me. But it's cool that he's doing it. I understand why he's doing it. He'll work with some female vocalists. He'll put something which is more like an 80s pop thing. And it might not be my cup of tea at the moment, but it's very impressive that he goes to do something like that, go out of the boundaries rather than just keeping the same. Okay, this has got to sound like Genesis. This has got to sound like Kansas, I like that he does that. And he gets a lot of grief for some of that stuff, but all power to him.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you there, because I agree that he's doing solo stuff. He's being adventurous, and he's it's hard to be an artist when you have an audience and they sort of want to see your most famous piece reproduced in just a little bit different or something,
Oh, yeah.
Because I think audiences tend to want to, they always say, oh, that's my favorite album, I don't like that one as much. But in order for an artist to have reached that point where they made that album that you loved, there were probably 10 other albums before that like this. It's a long journey. It's not a race. It's a long what do they call that? It's a long race. So
it's a marathon. Well,
marathon.
I was going to say, it's like I see in your wall behind you have the Genesis albums back there, Nursery Crime and Seconds Out.
Yeah.
The reason I became a Genesis fan and kept with them was, and a lot of people complain about it, is when Phil Collins started and they started gradually changing the type of stuff they're doing. And a lot of people, I don't want to hear them if they're not doing the 12-string and bass pedals prog anymore. But to me, the way they adjusted and moved and evolved, or some people would say devolved, was the reason I stuck with them. Because you're right, I find that if a band puts out too many albums in a row that sound alike, it's like, well, what's the point? Do something creative, do something different, try whatever. And so I think there's no other band besides Genesis where I was with them all the way. Whatever, however many albums, studio albums, 15, whatever they put out, only because they kept changing and evolving. And again, some would say not for the better, but I enjoyed everything they did.
Yeah. Well, I think if people just keep that in mind, that being a musician, it's not a job, it's sort of a passion. It's sort of you have to be moved and by your heart, and be true to yourself as an artist. And that's why I really like Steven Wilson. Actually, I'm the same as you. Some of his stuff doesn't hit you on the nail like like other stuff, but I still appreciate it. I still appreciate that he's he's trying new things. He's not afraid to lose some of his audience. But that's sort of a fact of life, I think. I mean, what artist or band with a really long career has kept all their fans? Maybe Rush is one exception, but I mean, even Rush, they're such passionate fans. They really can't stand some of their albums, but they'll still come to their shows.
Moving Pictures, it was too pop, or what? I know that you hear a lot of that, because I got into Rush when they put out I guess it was their second. Caress of Steel was actually I heard them on their first album, Fly By Night, and I was into them. But when they started putting out the proggy stuff, as they went into Farewell of the Kings and Hemispheres, to me, it just knocked me for a loop. It was so good and so into it. But I liked them when they went further, into the 80s. They're using more tech stuff. But I think, I know Rush fans, a lot of people were lost. They lost them because they weren't, they're not doing the heavy, 3-piece power stuff. but I thought all the stuff they did, I just kind of lost a little interest later, just because my taste moved away. I think the other group you could say that with is U2, because they did a couple things where they just did left turns and did something completely different when they could have just kind of milking the same formula. They went from Joshua Tree, which was a classic album at the time, and they could have kept on making the Joshua Tree, but they turned around and made Octung Baby, which was so different and but very successful. So I really admire when artists do stuff like that. They take a chance.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. I was just getting into U2 recently because I got away from them for many years, actually. But they used to be my favorite band for a while there, and like the Octung and all that stuff. That was, yeah. And Unforgettable Fire was one of my favorites by them.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's wow, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Unforgettable Fire and Joshua Tree. Like I said, they were so popular doing that stuff. They could have easily just, like I said, and we're just gonna make those, keep making those albums. They were gonna get, Daniel Lanois to produce them, and we'll just keep doing all this stuff. But yeah, they took a chance, which was great.
Yeah, Daniel Lanois. I'm in Canada, by the way, and
oh, cool.
British Columbia. And Daniel Lanois, I grew up in Ontario. I actually grew up in St. Catharines, which is home of Neil Peart. And never ran into him, though. I think he was older than me, so he's probably leaving town. But I know his parents still lived there in St. Catharines. So Rush is like they're like the home team for me. Growing up with Rush is just a fact of life. Rush was part of the Canadian culture, and it's a legendary band. So,
like I said, I grew up in Detroit, and I got into Rush when I was like late teens, early 20s. And because in Detroit, when they did a tour after Hemispheres called the semi tour of the Hemispheres before the next Permanent Waves came out, and they played just that area, from Toronto. They played a few places in Canada and all around the Great Lakes states. And me and my friends went to every Rush show. I think we went to like 11 or 12 of those shows in that concert because it was so easy. Oh, get in the car. Where are they tonight? Saginaw. Oh, it's only 100 miles away. Let's go. So I saw him a bunch of times. And of course, the classic band from around there was Max Webster, who opened for Rush a few times. So yeah, being from Detroit, I was well versed in all those Canadian bands.
Okay. Yeah. So, Sarnia.
Sarnia, I've been to Sarnia.
Probably London, Ontario. Did you ever been through there?
Yeah, I've been to all those. Yeah, because Windsor's across the border, so Ottawa, London, up to Toronto, and I was all over the place at that age. Yeah,
yeah. Oh, lucky you, man. I've only seen Rush a couple of times, in my life. So I saw the Hold Your Fire tour.
Yeah,
and I think it was the Snakes and Arrows was the other one I saw in Toronto. There.
Last time I saw him was in California. The Grace Under Pressure. Grace Under Pressure.
Is that right? Oh, well, that would have been interesting.
It was a killer show. And after that, I had a chance to go a couple times, but I just, for whatever reason, didn't. I think I just started to move away into different directions, what I liked. And I'd already seen him so many times, and it was always great to see him because he just kicked ass live with like a few others ever did.
Oh, yeah.
But I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So my timer is telling me we have a little over 4 minutes left on the Zoom account here.
Okay.
So I'd like to get back we'll round this interview off with just a quick discussion about PSA and what's happening right now. What you want to let people know about the band? What's going on in the future?
The album is coming out October 27th. We have another single coming out next week. You can get the album if you go to our website, psanimals1.com. You can find all the ordering options there or on our Facebook page, Pattern Seeking Animals. And you can order, vinyl, CD, digital downloads. You can find out where to stream the music. So that's coming out then. Hopefully we're going to do some live stuff next year, but that's still off in the distance. We're just concentrating on the album release at the moment. And then, I'm in the middle of writing for the next album already. So,
wonderful.
Because this album, we turned it in April. So just waiting 6 months just because of scheduling. We Record Harmony decided we wanted to release it like later in the year, and they had other things lined up they wanted to promote. So it's like, that's fine. Yeah. No problem.
Yeah. And you personally, you said you're working on the new album, and do work um, for other things besides this band?
No other musical stuff. The only thing I ever do is I have a friend who makes low budget horror movies
Hmm.
with a distributor and everything. And every once in a while, he'll call me up and say, "Hey, I need music for this thing," and it's low pay, but the agreement is, unlike other movies, he takes anything I give him. There's no revisions. You can't come back and say this doesn't work. So I can sit there on the weekend and churn something out. He's a good friend of mine, so I've known him forever. But so I'll do something like that. But no, I'm just concentrating on this band and writing this type of music.
Mhm.
Because it's the most fulfilling to me. This type of stuff is just what it is. And
Yeah.
the older you get, you want to kind of get away from some of this stuff, which isn't that meaningful to you.
Hmm. Well, once again, I want to reiterate that I didn't know about pattern seeking animals really. I did a reaction. I was very impressed, and I've started listening to your discography. Again, I'm really impressed. It's very fresh.
Cool.
People who like Steven Wilson will love it, or Yes, that kind of vibe. And every song, you can hear the strength of it. There's a songwriting element to it. It's not just fancy playing or anything like that.
Yeah, I
Well,
appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate that because it's real important to me.
and it's
To
very well produced as well. Like the balance I hear when it's mixed, how it's mixed and mastered. Uh,
yeah,
One thing that bothered me over the years was the heavy compression. Of course, we've all seen
yeah,
now those
brick wall,
sound bars that are just solid
brick wall.
blocks,
Yeah, I
brick
know.
walls.
I listen to
Yeah.
some of those. I listen to some of those '80s and '90s rock records, and they're unlistenable. They're super
Mhm.
high endy. It's just like it's almost boring a hole in your eardrums, and it's the same level. There's no dynamics. That drives
Yeah.
me nuts. So we're
Yeah.
really careful when mastering
I can
and
tell.
mixing. Yeah,
Yeah, it really sounds nice and clean.
cool.
Really nice. Yeah. Excellent job. So
Thanks.
so thanks again, John, and all the best to you. And
Absolutely.
we'll talk again someday. Hopefully, maybe we'll cross paths. Who knows?
Anytime I'm around.
All right, cool.
Very good.
So thanks everyone. The links are down below. And stay tuned for
Cool.
our next Prog chats, which gee, I don't who knows what's happening next.
Who
So
knows?
many things to explore.
Yeah, cool. Very
Okay.
good. Good
Have a
talking
good
to you.
day, John. Okay.
Bye.